My name is Elena, 28 years old, and in front of media cameras, my boyfriend's father called me street trash, and at that moment, there were over 40 distinguished guests at the party, all of them stunned. Was it because he's a billionaire that he could treat me, someone who sells paintings on the street, as trash? Everyone thought I would cry or lower my head and walk away. But no, they didn't know that besides creating art, I was also a freelance journalist. And very soon, I would make CEOs and billionaires bow their heads. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching this video from? And if you've ever been judged just because you came from a lower background, stay until the very end. Because the story you're about to hear will change the way you see silence, justice, and human nature. I'm a freelance painter from Ohio, raised in a neighborhood no one bothers to name on any artistic map. But that day, for the first time, my paintings were displayed at a small community exhibit in Boston. No reporters, no camera flashes, just aging walls and a few people who stopped by. I didn't expect anything grand, only hoped someone might pause long enough to look. And then he appeared. Christopher Blackwell, in a modest coat that still carried the aura of someone accustomed to a world with private elevators. He came in with a few friends, and his eyes stopped at my painting of street kids huddling together under the yellow light of a bus stop. He asked, "What inspired this painting?" I meant to say something clever, but ended up replying, "My mother. She used to stand there when I was little." Instead of chuckling like so many others had, he stayed silent for a long while. From that day on, he began visiting the tiny studio I rented behind a bakery. He asked me about life in Ohio, about my mother, the woman who worked 3 jobs just to get me through school. Christopher always avoided talking about his own family, but I knew he carried the Blackwell name, the biggest energy conglomerate in the East. One afternoon, he confessed, "My father wants me to take over the company. But I just want to live. Like you do." I told him about my dream to open a free art academy for underprivileged kids, an idea that felt impossibly distant with the income I made selling a few paintings. 6 months passed. We quietly dated, away from cameras and headlines. He was the first to believe in the value of the art I pursued. Hannah, my best friend, once warned me, "You're walking into a lion's den. Be careful." I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating. Then came the invitation to the Blackwell family dinner, an event tied to the signing of a multi-billion-dollar energy deal, with media coverage included. Christopher held my hand tightly. "Just be yourself. Don't try to become them." I practiced conversation for a week. Hannah helped pick a sleek, ash-gray dress. "Don't lose your identity," she said. That day, as I stepped out of the car, the Blackwell estate gates were crowded with reporters. The atmosphere was overwhelming, like walking into a drama series. But I was just a street painter. Evelyn, Christopher's mother, greeted me with a scrutinizing glance and whispered to a nearby reporter, "My son makes the strangest choices." In stark contrast, Victoria, Christopher's sister, was surprisingly kind, pulling me along to meet some VIPs, which helped ease my nerves. The gold-plated dining room where the dinner was held was a maze of power. Hollow laughter, misted wine glasses. I tried to keep my smile and my posture upright. Then he appeared. Gregory Blackwell, like a king entering his throne room. He looked at no one but flicked his gaze across me, then sat at the head of the table. The room held its breath. I knew I didn't belong here, but I also knew I had survived Ohio winters without heating and weeks of instant noodles. I told myself, nothing can break me. What I didn't expect was that just minutes later, that first condescending glance would ignite a battle that would reshape my life and his empire. I had just touched my glass of water, hadn't even brought it to my lips, when Gregory Blackwell spoke, his voice cold as ice echoing through the gold-lined dining room. "I hear you sell street art?" A few guests gave small smirks, the kind I'd seen in dismissive galleries, where they look at paintings like they're framed garbage. I lifted my head, steadying myself. My work reflects the truths out there, I replied, eyes fixed on him, unwavering. Gregory tilted his head slightly, lips curling like he'd just tasted cheap wine. The trash out there, he said, each word deliberate, and the sentence fell like a hailstorm into a quiet night. The table went silent. I heard the sudden stilling of silverware, the absence of clinking glasses. Christopher turned toward him, his gaze sharpening. "Dad." But I gently placed a hand on his under the table, signaling, "Not now." I didn't need anyone to defend me. I'd heard words like that from drunks outside bus stations back home. But this time, it didn't come from a nobody. It came from the man at the head of the table, a man who could make a mayor say, "Sir," and a CEO bow his head. I pressed my hand against the fabric of my dress, fingernails digging into my palm until it hurt. But my face didn't change. Only my eyes lit up, not with rage, but because I knew the battle had begun. And he had chosen the worst possible way to start it. Moments later, Gregory leaned back in his chair and lifted his wineglass with a disturbingly casual grace. His eyes scanned the table, as if about to declare something of consequence. Then, slowly, every word sharpened like stone, he said, "My son deserves a wife who's a CEO, someone who can run a company, not street trash." I could feel every gaze shift toward me. A few guests held their breath, others exchanged uneasy glances. But what startled me most was the tiny camera hidden behind the centerpiece, quietly recording the evening, placed there by a team of journalists invited to cover the private event. The lens now pointed directly at me. Christopher gripped the edge of his chair, his eyes glinting with restrained fury. "That's enough, Dad," he muttered, but Gregory didn't even glance at him. He sipped his wine, as if the conversation wasn't worth repeating. I slowly stood up. In that moment, everyone must have thought I'd storm out, cry, or erupt in anger. But instead, I pulled a thin folder from my handbag and gently laid it on the marble table, right in front of Gregory. Time in the room seemed to slow. I didn't raise my voice, but it rang clear and steady, slicing through the thick silence. "Before you define me with your words, you might want to reconsider what you're building under the Blackwell name." And then I simply looked at him, the man who had just called me trash, in front of dozens. But I didn't see a king. I saw a man sitting on a throne of illusion, on the verge of collapse. Before Gregory could respond, I nudged the folder toward him. "This is a copy of the environmental report Blackwell Corporation submitted to the federal government for its North Dakota energy project." I paused. "And this," I pulled another envelope from the back, "is the original field assessment that my collaborators and I compiled over 6 months, proving that most of the submitted data was falsified." Gregory froze, but his eyes quickly sharpened, cold and defensive. "What nonsense are you spouting?" His voice no longer calm, tinged now with a faint tremble. A partner seated to his left immediately leaned down to check his phone, whispering to his associate. I remained still. "I was a freelance investigative journalist before I sold street art," I said, scanning the room. "I've seen poisoned land where children can't breathe. I've heard families speak of brothers who died from contaminated water linked to Blackwell's projects, and I tracked every step of this report being edited." Gregory slammed his hand on the table. "You're slandering us." But his voice had lost its weight. It quivered, like wind through a cracked window. I didn't respond to him. I turned to look at every face around the table. "I'm not trash. I'm someone who listens to the truth you've buried beneath profit, and if I have to, I will say it loud, anywhere, anytime." The air in the room exploded into silent tension. A female journalist raised her phone to record, a bank executive slipped his hand from Evelyn's and stood up, and Gregory, for the first time all evening, fell utterly silent. as if recalculating an entire chessboard he thought he'd already won. Gregory shot to his feet, the table rattling, a glass of wine spilling over, staining the white tablecloth like blood seeping into snow. He growled, fury dripping from his voice, "You've ruined this family." But this time, his words no longer carried the weight of power. They echoed with the desperation of a man cornered beneath the glare of camera lights. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The evidence had spoken for me. I turned and walked out of the dining room with calm steps, as if I were merely leaving an unsuccessful exhibition. Behind me, Christopher pushed back his chair and rushed after me. "Elena, wait," he called. He grabbed my hand in the grand marble hallway, chandelier light spilling across the impossibly high ceiling, making the space sway like it, too, had lost its footing. "You didn't have to do this alone," he said, breathless. But I looked at him and gently pulled my hand away. "This is a battle I chose, long before I met you." My voice held no anger, no bitterness, only truth. And truth is always cold when exposed. Just then, a quiet voice came from the staircase. "You're not alone." I turned. It was Victoria, Christopher's sister, standing at the corner of the hall, her gaze both anxious and resolute. She looked around, then hurried toward me, clutching a small silver USB. "I know the company's hiding things. I've seen the internal emails. I don't fully understand them, but I can help." There was no pity in her eyes. Only the conflict of someone raised within the Blackwell family, now beginning to see the cracks forming in its walls. I took the USB, gripped it tightly. "No thank you. No promises." We both understood. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The storm had broken, and this time, it couldn't be stopped with money or power. I left the hallway, planning to return to my studio, but a man in black stopped me near the exit. "Mrs. Evelyn would like a word. Just a few minutes." I hesitated. Something in his tone didn't feel like a trap, but something deeper. I nodded. They led me into a small room in the back, eerily quiet. No chandeliers, no clinking glasses, only a dark wooden table and two chairs facing each other. Evelyn was already seated. She wore none of her usual icy formality, but a soft, beige cardigan, as if this was a version of Evelyn from a life she never chose. "You've made things complicated," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want more scandal for this family. And I believe you don't want to become a tool for the media." I said nothing. She opened her purse and placed a thick envelope on the table. $3 million, she said, and a prestigious art scholarship in Florence. Enough to start your academy. Enough to leave here. Quietly. I looked at the envelope, then at her. Is this an offer from a mother, or from a CEO backed into a corner? Evelyn smiled, a smile that never reached her eyes. "I've been both, Elena. But what matters is, I know what's best for everyone involved." I stood up, never touching the envelope. I can't build dreams from concrete mixed with lies, even if you wrap it in Italian silk or gild it in gold. I walked out, leaving her there, motionless, like a porcelain statue on the verge of cracking. Minutes later, Hannah sent me a link. The #sign Street Garbage Girl was trending nationwide. They were mocking me. They were replaying the clip of Gregory's insult, adding effects, laugh tracks. I watched my face turned into an internet joke. But I didn't break. Because I knew. They were afraid. And those hashtags would soon become the blades turned back on them. I never imagined the truth could cause a storm like this. Less than 12 hours later, while I was still trying to organize my emotions and data in my tiny studio, the counterattack began. Gregory held an emergency press conference in front of the Blackwell Industries headquarters, stepping out with a calm expression, his light gray suit pressed to perfection. In front of dozens of cameras, he declared, Elena Fisher, a woman of unknown background, formerly posing as a freelance journalist, approached my son with financial motives. The allegations she's made are not only false, but fabricated with the intent to damage my family's brand and reputation. He paused, looking straight into the nearest camera. I consider this an elaborate extortion attempt, and we will pursue legal action. That afternoon, my inbox exploded with hundreds of messages, most of them vicious. They called me a gold digger, a street girl posing as an artist. Some edited my photo with the word hoax in bold red across my forehead. Some sent me the address of my studio, threatening to talk with a baseball bat. I sat there, staring at the screen, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the fury burning in my throat. This is how they twist the truth. This is how they teach a woman that if she dares to speak up, she will be shredded by a machine built for smear. But then, something unexpected happened. At 7 p.m., Christopher appeared live on his personal page. Simple lighting, no backdrop, no prep. Just him, in front of a webcam, eyes clear and unflinching. I'm Christopher Blackwell. And I'm saying no to my father. No to deceit, no to evading responsibility, no to how he treated Elena, a woman who is brave, honest, and unbreakable. He paused, his hands tightening into fists, then continued, "If I have to choose between power and truth, I choose truth. And if there's a price to pay for that, I'm ready." Within 15 minutes, his video had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. The comments flooded in. Finally, someone from that family speaks up. Elena's not alone. Whistleblower gets the love she deserves. I stared at the screen, my eyes stinging. Not because I needed saving, but because I knew in a war this big, having someone beside you can be the one thing that keeps you from falling. That night, as rain streaked across the studio's glass window and the world outside sank into darkness, I sat surrounded by a mess of documents when my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "It's me. Can we talk? You still at the studio?" I hadn't even replied when someone knocked. I opened the door. It was Victoria, Christopher's sister, wearing a hooded sweatshirt holding the same silver USB I had seen before. But this time it wasn't hesitation. It was deliberate choice. "It took me 2 days to get this," she whispered, handing it to me. "It's the internal emails, meeting schedules, and most importantly, 2 attachments. The original environmental inspection reports and an email confirming an off-budget payment to a federal inspector, all sent from my father's private email account." I stood frozen for a moment. The girl before me, raised in a whitestone mansion, schooled in Switzerland, was now handing over evidence that could get her father indicted. I looked at Victoria, wanting to ask why, but she shook her head. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. I've lived in that house long enough to know what's rotten and what deserves to start over." I clenched the USB in my hand. "Thank you." Victoria nodded, then turned and disappeared into the misty rain. That very night, I contacted an old friend, a former colleague from the Boston Herald, now an investigative advisor at the federal court. We met at a 24-hour cafe. When I placed the USB on the table, he looked at me and said nothing, just nodded. The wheels of justice had begun to turn. There was no turning back for Gregory now. And this time, the battle wouldn't be fought over a gold-plated dining table, but in a place where numbers, documents, and living proof would determine justice. Just 3 days after the evidence was submitted, the shockwaves began to spread like cracks on glass. Blackwell Industries stock, once an unshakable icon on the New York Exchange, plummeted unexpectedly. 30% of its value vanished in a single trading session. Major news outlets, like CNBC, Bloomberg, and Reuters, simultaneously reported on a federal investigation involving falsified environmental reports and bribery in the energy sector. several key partners, including a South Korean company preparing to sign a $4 billion deal, announced they would suspend all cooperation pending the results of the investigation. Blackwell's PR office worked through the night trying to contain the crisis, but the more they tried to cover, the more it unraveled. And then came the final straw. The full, unedited video from the dinner party, where Gregory called me street trash, was leaked. The internet no longer laughed. It roared in outrage. The hashtag number Street Garbage Girl, once used in mockery, became a symbol of resistance, appearing on t-shirts, phone wallpapers, and even graffiti murals across walls in New York and San Francisco. Within 24 hours, the video aired on The Late Show, with the host declaring, "We're witnessing a modern-day Titanic, only this time the person ringing the alarm bell is a freelance painter from Ohio." Gregory convened an emergency meeting at headquarters, summoning dozens of regional directors to regain control. But an image of him slamming his hand on the table, shouting at a media advisor, secretly recorded by an employee, was soon broadcast on evening news, becoming a viral meme across the country. And in the familiar white stone mansion, Evelyn Blackwell stood by the window, the media lights outside casting long shadows across the wall. She gave no answer to reporters, but when she turned back inside, someone caught her voice, hoarse, weary, speaking to her assistant. "We didn't lose because of a woman. We lost because he thought he was untouchable." The Blackwell empire didn't fall with a crash. It cracked, layer by scornful words, doctored numbers, and the prolonged silence of a woman who once believed everything could be bought with a thick envelope. That night, after all the headlines, the market numbers, the videos viewed millions of times, I sat alone in the studio, the single yellow bulb overhead flickering like it, too, was tired. Outside, rain drizzled, soft, not loud enough to drown the wind, but enough to make the city's gray walls feel colder. I sat on the old chair, in front of an unfinished canvas, but my hands couldn't hold the brush. What had I really won? An empire fallen? Yes. Justice, finally in motion? Yes. But inside me was a vast emptiness. They called me a symbol, brave, but none of them saw how much I trembled opening those first emails, how many sleepless nights I endured fearing the consequences. The threats still came. Someone photoshopped my face onto a torn billboard with the words "Parasite Artist." I cried. Not loudly, just silent tears falling on my clenched hands. The door creaked open. It was Hannah. She said nothing. She came over, sat beside me, and wrapped her arms around me like a sister would. "You sparked change," she whispered. "You have no idea how many people out there see themselves in you." I leaned into her shoulder, finding a sliver of warmth in a world grown cold with ambition and power. A second knock. Christopher, his face wet from the rain, but his eyes glowing like moonlight in a storm. He walked in, didn't ask questions, just came forward, knelt on one knee before me. "If I have to choose between you and everything else, I choose you. Not the company, not the career, not the legacy. Just you." I looked at him, the man who had lived in a world where every choice was made by powerful hands. And now he stood with me, the woman his father once called trash. I didn't say anything, just reached out, touched his cheek, and pulled him into a long embrace. Not for romance, but so we could both remember. In the middle of the storm, there's still somewhere to lean on. And if tomorrow is the last day of this fight, then tonight, we are not alone. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still hung heavy, as if the whole city was holding its breath. I walked into the federal building, the one I used to avoid whenever I passed by, back when I was just a girl, selling art on the streets. Today, I carried no brush, no painting, just a sealed hard drive tucked in a cloth bag that read, "Truth will be louder." The federal agent who greeted me didn't look surprised. He looked ready. He'd already reviewed the copy I sent the night it all began. Today, he was receiving the original. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time. I nodded. I have nothing left to lose, but millions are waiting for something right to happen. When I placed the drive on the desk, my hand didn't tremble anymore. It was no longer just evidence. It was a torch. Meanwhile, across the city, outside Blackwell Industries HQ, the press had gathered early, and they didn't have to wait long. The glass doors opened and Gregory Blackwell stepped out, flanked by two federal agents in gray suits. They didn't cuff him, not yet. But the cameras captured his face clearly as the lead officer announced, "Mr. Gregory Blackwell, you are being summoned for urgent federal investigation into fraudulent environmental reporting and high-level bribery." Gregory raised his head, trying to maintain composure, but his eyes blinked rapidly. He turned to speak to the reporters, but no one held out a microphone. Only lenses. And in that moment, the man who had once humiliated me at a gold-plated dinner table now stood drowning in a sea of cameras, his steps slowing like an old man lost in the kingdom he once ruled. I watched it all on my laptop, in my worn studio, where my paintings still hung quietly on the walls. I didn't smile. I didn't sigh. I simply closed the laptop. Because I knew. This wasn't the end. It was a shift, from lies to truth, from power to justice. And I was no longer the street garbage girl. I was the one who chose to speak up, and this time my voice was loud enough for an empire to hear. The news of the Blackwell scandal quickly spilled beyond finance. It ignited like a flame inside a society starved for justice. The New York Times called it the unmasking of an empire. The Washington Post wrote, "It wasn't the government or a rival corporation. It was an unknown female painter who shook one of the country's top conglomerates." Within 48 hours, the name Elena Fisher flooded every headline, forum, and TV segment. But not with the label of rebel I had once feared, instead with a phrase I never imagined, whistleblower of the year. I was invited to countless talk shows, from morning news to in-depth programs on art and justice. They asked how I felt standing alone against an empire. I simply answered, I was never alone. I stood on the truths others were too afraid to speak. And then one afternoon, just after finishing an interview at the local radio station, I saw two women waiting outside. One wore a supermarket uniform, holding a printed copy of the first painting I ever exhibited last year. The other was a young girl with a torn backpack, holding a marker. "Can you sign this?" they asked. I did. Not because I saw myself as someone great, but because I knew this story wasn't just mine anymore. On street corners, in classrooms, at city council meetings, people began talking about rechecking environmental contracts. Student groups started sharing the documents I released. Children once pushed aside for where they came from were now featured in my art, and that art was now part of national campaigns. A new wind was blowing. Slow, steady, but unstoppable. And in the heart of it all, I, the girl once called street trash, was now invited to speak at a TED Talk on truth, courage, and personal power. But for me, the greatest reward wasn't a title. It was this feeling. The world had finally started to listen. Not because I shouted louder, but because I stopped staying silent. Christopher sat across from me in the studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases and new frames sketched with first lines. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the dusty window, casting a glow on his hand resting atop a stack of documents. No suit, no Rolex, just a man, and his final decision. "I've resigned from the board," he said, voice soft but resolute. "As of today, I'm no longer the future CEO, no longer the Blackwell heir. I'm just me." I didn't speak, not because I doubted him, but because I saw it in his eyes. A lifelong pain, once buried deep, now thawing like ice. And I'm not stepping down to escape. I'm stepping away to rebuild, not with power, but with something real. He reached into his bag and laid a proposal on the table. Handwritten on the cover, "Art for Change, a foundation for children denied opportunity." I flipped through the pages. It was a model for a small academy blending art, mental health, and community. Transparent operating costs. A volunteer network. All the things I had once imagined in dreams, now laid out in real lines. "We'll open the first location in Dorchester," Christopher said, eyes resting on the painting on the wall. The one with the little boy clutching a worn-out backpack at the bus stop. "The place you told me. Your mother used to wait for the last bus every day." I nodded, choking up. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something deeper. Finally, someone understood. Not just stood with me, but chose to walk beside me. In the corner of the room, Hannah watched us, smiling, eyes glistening. "Instead of tearing down," she said, "you're planting again." And I knew. From this point on, the story was no longer about a single night of humiliation at a gold-plated dinner table. It was about how one right choice, one moment of saying no, could change a life. Not just mine, but hundreds, thousands, waiting for a flicker of light. That morning in federal court wasn't as loud as I'd imagined. Everyone sat in silence, as if we all knew the moment unfolding was a cut through history, not just because of the name Blackwell, but because of who was about to take the witness stand. Victoria. She wore a light gray blazer, her hair neatly tied up, looking more mature than ever, but her eyes remained the same, clear, honest, and this time, unafraid. The lawyer questioned her about the chain of internal emails, the off-budget meetings, and who gave direct orders. Victoria didn't flinch. She answered each question precisely. When asked, "Were you ever pressured to stay silent?" she paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. My father once told me, if you let this out, the whole family will fall apart. But I realized, a family shouldn't be built on fear." The courtroom fell completely still. I watched her from the back row, sitting between Christopher and Hannah. Victoria's face was wet with tears, but she didn't bow her head. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, voice slightly shaking. "I'm here to say that silence saves no one. And if part of the fault lies in the fact that I once looked away, then today, I choose to face it." Gregory sat only steps away, his eyes empty. He didn't speak. No shouting like before. Just sat there, quiet, as if his empire had decayed from the inside out. After the trial, Victoria walked briskly into the hallway, where the press waited. But instead of fleeing, she stopped, looked up, and said just one sentence. "If you live in a family where truth is forbidden, you are not alone. I've been there too." That sentence would later be painted on the wall of the first art academy we built, and to me it wasn't just a testimony, it was redemption, a hand reaching out from a shattered past, and a real step toward the justice we'd chased all along. A week after the trial, the media still mentioned the name Gregory Blackwell, but no longer in praise of business strategy. Now it was about record-breaking fines in the energy sector for fraudulent reporting, federal bribery, and witness intimidation. Blackwell Industries, the empire once perched atop the market, now faced the risk of having its license revoked in multiple states. Meanwhile, Evelyn, the woman who once stood behind every polished scene, vanished from public life. She declined all interviews, left the Whitestone mansion, and no one knew where she went. One day, I received a parcel from an unknown sender. Inside was a handwritten letter, the cursive slanted, only a single line. "You did what our generation never dared to. Don't stop." At the bottom it was signed, Edith Blackwell, Christopher's grandmother. I folded the letter and placed it beside the first photo I took with the children in the Dorchester studio. Outside, summer was arriving. In the courtyard of the Art for Change Academy, the kids were laughing out loud. One painted flying fish in a purple sky. Another was learning how to mix colors for sadness. And me, I stood at the edge, watching. Not as someone who won, but as someone who was finally living again. That evening, during the first exhibition by our students, Christopher pulled me into the center of the gallery. On the wall hung a piece by a boy who once feared speaking, now drawing a house in golden yellow with the words, "Truth is home." Christopher knelt down and pulled a silver ring from his pocket. No diamond, just engraved with 3 words. You stayed true. I didn't cry. I just nodded, because I knew that moment wasn't some fairy tale ending. It was a quiet reward for those who walked through darkness without letting their light go out. The final scene, before the lights fade, the screen splits in two. On one side, Gregory Blackwell, walking slowly in prison garb, hands cuffed, head bowed under cold ceiling lights. On the other side, me, wearing a paint-stained shirt, smiling among the children, palette still in hand. And I believe, if someone has ever called you trash, remember, even from waste, flowers can bloom. I am proof. And you can be too, if you choose truth and never back down. Have you ever been looked at like you were less, just because you didn't come from where they expected? Or worse, have you stayed silent, thinking, if I speak up, I'll lose everything? I used to believe that. I used to think silence was safety, but I learned that when you speak, even with a trembling voice, even if you're alone, the truth will find you, and you won't be alone for long. If my story, Elena Fisher's story, felt like a reflection of your own, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever been called too sensitive, too dreamy, too small, hit like, subscribe. Not just to help the YouTube algorithm carry this story further, but to remind the world that courage, justice, and dignity never go out of style. We don't need power to change the world. We just need to stay true to ourselves. And if anyone has ever called you trash, remember, even from waste, flowers can grow.